With Death Battle's next episode of Mahito vs. Shigaraki just on the horizon, an episode I am super hyped for, might I add, I figured I'd throw my hat into the ring and make a video giving my own thoughts on the debate. Because while I understand why people see it as such, I think the general audience severely underestimates how much debate there actually is to this matchup. Most view this as an easy, no-diff win for Shigaraki, but I'm here to tell you that not only does Mahito stand far more of a chance than you'd think, but that he actually wins. Now, before we get into the debate, I'd like to immediately preface that this is not a prediction video. Despite being the biggest Mahito sider in the Death Battle community, I've long since accepted that he's cooked when it comes to an actual episode. Now, that's not to say I think Death Battle will research it badly. I think this matchup is extremely debatable after all. It's just that Shigaraki is the far more likely winner for an episode. The goal of this video isn't to say Mahito is going to win the episode, but to discuss the matchup on a more general level and detail why I think Mahito has what it takes to pull off a win, and in the process, hopefully convince people he's not just a punching bag here. With that, let's get into the debate. I'm going to be breaking this analysis down into multiple segments, so let's start with our first topic, stats. Let's not beat around the bush here. In terms of stats, Shigaraki absolutely demolishes Mahito. Without getting into more debatable scaling, the best stats you can scale Mahito to are 240 kilotons of TNT via scaling to the formation of Jogo's meteor, and around Mach 200 and 900 via being able to perform Black Flash in a microsecond. Certainly not weak by any means, but he simply pales in comparison to Shigaraki, who can easily upscale feats in the teratons of TNT and has his own feats that get in the relativistic ranges. Even accounting for the buffs Mahito receives from his distorted killing form and his domain, he'd still be thousands of times weaker and almost 100 times slower, making this an easy point for Shigaraki. Abilities, however, is a more interesting discussion. While Shigaraki has far more abilities thanks to All For One and his continuous adaptations, Mahito's singular ability of Idle Transfiguration is far more versatile than any singular quirk Shigaraki possesses. On that same note, while Shigaraki is overall more versatile, he's typically a very straightforward fighter, rarely using the full extent of his quirk library. So in a natural encounter, Mahito is likely to be the far more versatile fighter, especially given he is the more skilled fighter as well. However, when comparing their evolutions, Shigaraki's is far more impressive, working at a much faster rate and being capable of more extreme adaptations. Overall, while Mahito's shapeshifting gives him more than enough versatility to keep up in the fight, especially considering how limited Shiggy usually is, Shigaraki's vast amount of powers he has the potential to use, along with his superior evolution, should net him the edge in this category. One final thing I'd like to address in terms of abilities before we move on is whether Shigaraki can see Mahito or not. This is a question that gets a lot of discussion, so I'd figure it'd be worth mentioning, and the answer is yes. At bare minimum, quirks like Danger Sense or Vibration Sensing would at least clue Shigaraki in on his presence. Being able to fully see Mahito is a bit more debatable, however he's been able to spot invisible entities before, and more importantly, can see in infrared. Kenjaku confirmed that curses exist on a separate light wavelength, albeit never which one specifically, but given Shigi can see infrared, he could probably view the wavelength that curses exist on as well. Considering the amount of damage these two can dish out in just a touch, figuring out who can survive more damage is an important factor. To quickly get it out of the way, Mahito's cursed physiology likely doesn't help him much here. While JJK makes it clear very early on that cursed energy is needed to harm curses, the series also establishes early on that conventional weaponry is capable of harming them. It's a weird contradictory scenario, and both of these are backed up later in the series by Maki and Toji respectively. There's evidence for both sides, but due to being contradicted in series and me wanting to avoid a no limits fallacy, it's safest to say you wouldn't need cursed energy to harm one. Or at the very least, they'd only have a slight resistance to physical damage, which given the stat difference here wouldn't matter much. Aside from physiology though, both characters have their own ways of regeneration, and comparing them side by side shows Mahito's is pretty easily superior. Shigaraki's best feat of regeneration is during his fight with Stars and Stripes, where he regenerated from severe burns across his whole body and a missing limb. But feats like these are the usual for Mahito's regeneration, who can easily regenerate from being completely crushed and beheaded. Shigaraki can achieve a greater amount of regeneration through shedding his previous body with his adaptation, which has allowed him to heal from a large hole in his chest. But it's likely this form of healing is more limited considering its singular usage in a longer time frame. Even if it wasn't, Mahito's more notable examples of regeneration still prove superior, with him being able to regenerate from just a head and even more impressively from blowing his entire body up from the inside. One last factor to consider though is how effective their regeneration is against each other, and more specifically their main abilities. We'll discuss Idle Transfiguration more in depth in just a minute, but for now what's important to know is that it cannot be regenerated from, at least not normally. The damage it inflicts is to the shape of your soul, which is not only shown to be extremely difficult to heal, but cannot be healed at all by physical means since the soul determines the body's shape in JJK. Conversely, decay has no such counter to regeneration. Its spread has been stopped by multiple characters before, and from there it's as simple as healing back what was cut off. And while Mahito may be far slower than Shigaraki, he should be faster than Decay. Per Shigaraki's own estimates, Decay is capable of traveling at around 650,000 square meters per second, and thus could spread across Mahito in just over 3 microseconds. But as established earlier, Mahito is capable of reacting within a singular microsecond, meaning he'd have enough time to react to the oncoming spread of Decay. All this is to say that in terms of survivability, Mahito takes it pretty safely thanks to just being a lot harder to put down for good. Mahito's survivability is inherently tied to his soul, however, which leads us to the core of this debate, how both characters, and more importantly Shigaraki, interact with the soul and by proxy idol transfiguration. The vast majority of debate for this match can be found here, so much so that this category is ironically going to need its own categories, starting with... Short answer, it doesn't matter. Long answer, we know My Hero characters have souls, as they're referenced multiple times, and it's made clear Vestiges are different from the typical souls, with All For One and his Vestige being able to exist separately as the most clear example. However, while Vestiges are tied to quirks, which are biological, they are also treated as spiritual, and even referred to as spirits. It's debatable, but the important thing here is that they are not typical souls. They can be argued similar though, and it's likely if you can affect one, you can affect the other. Ultimately though, this really doesn't matter, as you'll see in the coming sections. Due to the significant gap in strength, Mahito's normal attacks are made completely ineffective here. But since Idol Transfiguration manipulates the soul, it would bypass Shigaraki's physical durability and give Mahito the means he needs to secure a win. However, this is all assuming that the ability would work on him. Shigaraki has a few arguments for resisting it, so let's go over them. Firstly, there's Shigaraki's Ball of Hatred that protected his soul against Deku's One-For-All transfers and All-For-One's takeover, with people arguing it would similarly protect him from Idol Transfiguration. The key issue with this argument, however, is that the soul shield is still located inside of his soul and was only ever meant to protect the innermost parts of his soul. Since it is still a part of his overall soul and hasn't shown any resistances to soul manipulation before, it would just be affected like the rest of his soul by Idol Transfiguration. The other and far more popular argument for him resisting Idol Transfiguration is that similar to how Sukuna stopped Mahito from affecting Yuji, Shigaraki's Vestiges, and more specifically All For One, would be able to stop Mahito from affecting Shigaraki's soul. I think a lot of the issues with this argument can be attributed to misinformation on how Mahito and Sukuna's interactions actually worked. Mostly in that Mahito is not the one who caused those interactions. Throughout the series, every other time we see Mahito use Idol Transfiguration on someone, he does not enter their innate domain like with Sukuna, and there's no evidence to suggest otherwise. This is supported in the scene given that Mahito's surprised when he ends up in Sukuna's innate domain, since that's not how his technique is supposed to go. Given Mahito used the technique on Yuji, it would also make more sense for him to end up in his innate domain if that was how his ability actually worked. Additionally, Sukuna is no stranger to messing with souls, as shown when he transferred Unlimited Void to Megami Soul while he was in his body. All this is to say that while it is kept vague, we know the reason Sukuna was able to counter Mahito was specifically due to Sukuna and his own abilities and not anything to do with how Mahito's ability works. What this means is that in order for the argument of Shigaraki's Vestiges countering Idol Transfiguration to work, they'd need to have displayed a similar ability to how Sukuna was able to drag Mahito into his innate domain, which they have no examples of. Shigaraki's Vestiges have only ever been able to affect souls that enter his inner realm, so given that Mahito's ability doesn't make him enter innate domains, and the Vestiges lack a way to force him into this inner world, they'd have no way to prevent Idol Transfiguration. It'd be like trying to hit an opponent with a wall in the way. Since the Vestiges don't have a way to counter Idol Transfiguration, they actually become more of a detriment to Shigaraki. As shown in his Battle with Stars and Stripes, destroying his Vestiges reflects back onto Shigaraki's physical body and would make him lose the quirk attributed with it. Given Sukuna proved that Idol Transfiguration affects every soul in the body, this would mean that even if Shigaraki managed to survive a hit from Idol Transfiguration, he'd likely lose numerous quirks in the process. That's assuming he even would survive it though. Considering his counters to it don't work, and both times Shigaraki has faced soul hacks in the series that's nearly killed him, it's likely Idol Transfiguration could just one-shot Shigaraki. So we know Mahito can affect Shigaraki's soul, but what about vice versa? Surprisingly, despite having interacted with spirits multiple times throughout My Hero, Shigaraki has actually never demonstrated any way of damaging or affecting souls, at least not in any applicable ways. The main example people use for this is when Shigaraki decayed Deku's arms in his Vestige world, which then reflected back onto his real body. Similar to the Vestige argument from earlier, the issue here is that it required Deku to be in the Vestige realm. Since it's two souls directly interacting here, it makes sense he'd be able to affect it, but in the outside world where he doesn't have that direct interaction, he's never shown the ability to still be capable of damaging souls. Though another point you can make is that Shigi would be able to hurt Mahito's soul due to being a vessel for another soul similar to Yuji. I think this is definitely the best argument you can make for Shigaraki being able to hit Mahito's soul, but there are a few issues I have with it. Firstly, vessels being able to harm souls in JJK is already inconsistent. Every other vessel we see in the series isn't capable of such, and there's a possibility that it's more so a trait exclusive to Yuji, which would make sense considering he eventually evolved this into his own ability. More importantly though, Shigaraki isn't really a vessel for another soul. Yes, he has numerous vestiges, but as we established earlier, those are explicitly different from typical souls. While they can be argued similar in nature, they are very clearly a separate thing, and thus Shigaraki wouldn't actually be a vessel for any souls inside of him. It's definitely getting close to semantics, but combined with the fact Shigaraki has never affected a soul like this, it's unlikely he'd be capable of mimicking what Yuji was capable of. So Shigaraki can't hurt Mahito's soul, but couldn't he just keep damaging Mahito until he runs out of cursed energy? After all, his regeneration is tied to his technique. While this line of thinking makes sense, Mahito actually has enough to show that this scenario is very unlikely. First off, the amount of cursed energy Mahito uses to heal is very low, like extremely low. After his fight with Nanami, Mahito confirmed that the cursed energy he uses to sustain his soul's shape is automatically generated and supplied by himself. So what does this mean? Basically, all Jujutsu sorcerers automatically regenerate their cursed energy over time. Similar to how Gojo constantly refreshes his brain with the reverse curse technique, Mahito is able to constantly sustain his soul's shape as the cursed energy required to do it is lower than the amount of cursed energy he automatically regenerates. Since the energy he needs to regenerate will always be refilling, Shigaraki doesn't have a reliable way to run him out of cursed energy throughout the fight. But what about Mahito's domain? In JJK, after characters use their domain expansions, they're temporarily unable to use their curse techniques. Considering the speed gap, it's likely Mahito would go for this technique, and from there, Shigaraki can just kill him while his regeneration is down, no? Well, there's just one issue. Mahito doesn't play by the rules. In his fight with Mekamaru, Mahito was able to use his technique mere moments after he used his domain. This is consistent with him being able to regain his technique back just seconds after he used his 0.2 domain in Shibuya. Why can Mahito do this? Who knows, guess he's just built different. But the point here is that once again, Shigaraki doesn't have a reliable way to run Mahito out of cursed energy, since the window where Mahito's CT isn't available would be minuscule. If he wants to get past Mahito's regeneration, he has to beat it outright. Which, to his credit, he has the ability to. While Mahito's regeneration is extremely powerful, he's never survived complete bodily destruction, and Shigaraki has some quirks in his library that could be capable of just that. But when it comes to the soul, Shigaraki simply has no way to harm Mahito's, and no way to protect his own from idle transfiguration, giving the point here to Mahito. So with all of that out of the way, let's cover our final category and go over why I think Mahito manages to warm out a win. First up, Mahito's domain is pretty much an instant win for himself. While Shigaraki's speed makes Mahito landing idle transfiguration normally practically impossible, his domain gets around this issue by covering a large area. In its fight with Mekamaru, it could cover the entire width of a lake, a distance that should be more than enough to capture Shigaraki since he's not a very ranged fighter. It's unlikely Shigaraki can outrun it either, considering Mahito's barrier can form at massively hypersonic speeds. While Shigaraki's reactions are faster than this, and Danger Sense would clue him in on the threat, his best travel speed feed is only around Mach 4, significantly slower than the speed the domain would be forming at. So even though he can see it coming, the chances of him being able to avoid it are minuscule, and once Shigaraki is in that domain, it's wraps. If caught inside the domain, the sure hit effect would activate instantly, considering Mahito could imbue the technique into his domain as it is forming. And with no reliable counter to idle transfiguration, Shigaraki would be dead right then and there. But what about Shigaraki's win cons? As established earlier, Shigaraki has a way to win through his large-scale AoE moves, and he's more than fast enough to get these off before Mahito could use his win con, so why wouldn't he win off these? Simply put, Shigaraki resorting to these is extremely unlikely. It was brought up back in the abilities section, but Shigaraki's a very straightforward fighter and never uses these kinds of quirks. The only AoE quirk Shigaraki consistently uses is Decay, but as we also established earlier, Mahito would be fast enough to react to it and counter. Even then, with the exception of All For One's massive explosion quirk, pretty much all of Shigaraki's AoE options aren't guaranteed to net a win. While most are big enough to cover and destroy Mahito's whole body, this assumes he wouldn't split his body up to protect himself, a strategy he's done numerous times in series to dodge attacks. While it is far from a surefire counter given the speed gap, Mahito having any potential counter is certainly better than Shigaraki having practically zero. Overall, while Shigi definitely has the means to kill Mahito, I don't see him resorting to these quirks before Mahito resorts to his win condition, which he has used far more consistently than Shigaraki. Mahito is also a far more skilled and tactical fighter, meaning he'd likely realize what he needs to win before Shigaraki does. Finally, Mahito's win condition is more reliable than Shigaraki's, with Shigi having basically zero counters once Mahito decides to open the domain, in contrast to Mahito's body splitting giving him ways to avoid some of Shigi's AoE options, giving Mahito the final edge in this debate. So yeah, though Shigaraki's untouchable stats and wide array of abilities means he's going to be dominating most of this fight, Mahito has the survivability to keep him in the game long enough to land his win condition that Shigaraki doesn't have a reliable counter to. All in all, this is an incredibly close debate, and one I think can honestly go either way. Whether you agree or disagree with Mahito winning, I hope you can come out of this video with a new outlook on the debate, since I think it's a fascinating discussion that people severely overlook. Anyways, that's all for me. Thanks to my pals Dor and Igneous for helping with this video, and see y'all in a few weeks when I talk about the actual episode.